So last week was a giant cliffhanger. I don't know if you remember, but it was a giant cliffhanger. Maybe not for us in our kind of day and age, in our culture, in the way that we think and the way that we understand Scripture, but for the disciples, last week was the ultimate cliffhanger. Okay, it really was. I don't know what TV shows, what movies you watch where there's, it's coming to the end. You think, oh, they're going to resolve everything, and then something happens. You're like, oh, no. I feel like every TV show is that way now because they want to hook you to make you watch more. Well, if you remember, okay, they were up in Caesarea Philippi, and Peter proclaimed Jesus as the Messiah. And it was this huge deal, right? Jesus was like, absolutely. In fact, you're speaking for the Father right now. He revealed this to you, huge deal. And then, although he proclaimed Jesus as the Messiah, he wasn't quite like on the same page with Jesus in what that meant. And so when Jesus said, yes, I am the Messiah, but just so you know, I'm going to have to suffer and die at the hands of the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. And Peter took him aside and rebuked him because he was like, no, not going to happen, Jesus. You're not going to do that. That's not the way of the Messiah. And Jesus says, kindly, get behind me, Satan. I'm sure he said it in the most loving way that there is. Love is also firm, as all parents know. And he said this, it was really actually beautiful. Even in that rebuke, he invited Peter back into following him. He wasn't like, I'm done with you because you said the wrong thing, because you don't understand the full picture of who I am and what I want to do, what I need to do. Instead, he invited him back to follow him. And then he looked at all of his followers and said, all of you, you're welcome to follow me too, but the path that I walk is a path towards the cross. And if you're going to walk in my footsteps, you have to walk in the path that leads to your own cross. As you daily deny yourself, take up your own cross and follow after me. That it's not about what I want, what I desire, what I hope, what I dream. It's about walking in the footsteps of Jesus, which is a living sacrifice, as Paul says, and that's difficult. And then he said this, and this is the cliffhanger. He said this, it's chapter 16, verse 28. He said, truly I say to you that there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. What? Did you hear that? Now, this doesn't spark in your mind, likely, maybe it does, but it's likely it doesn't spark in your mind what it sparked in the minds of the disciples. This sentence that he just said was epic. It's hard to imagine what it would have been like to be one of the disciples standing there and hearing Jesus say that one of us, some of us, won't die before we see him coming, the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Because this was a hope, was an expectation for the Jewish people coming directly from Daniel chapter 7. So in the book of Daniel, Daniel 7, his vision that he has, this dream that he has is the center of the book. And in this vision, what he sees is what has happened since creation. So it begins with these lifeless, chaotic waters. And these winds coming over the lifeless, chaotic waters. And I'm sure you're thinking Genesis chapter 1, right? There was the waters and the Spirit of God hovered over the waters. So what he's seeing is creation. But what comes out of it is not these incredibly beautiful days of creation and this order and this perfect relationship with God and humanity. Instead, what he sees are these beasts coming out of the wind and the waters. And these beasts are representing these human kingdoms, because what has happened is humanity chose to rebel against God. They chose, rather than to worship God, they chose to worship the creators and the creation. And what happened is humanity became like beasts. These corrupted, like morphed beasts, because of the destructive impulses and the way that we work out in violence. And that's what Daniel sees, instead of what we see in Genesis 1 that should have continued throughout day 7 throughout eternity. Daniel sees what has happened since then. It's been corrupted and destructive and violent and horrible. And this last beast that comes out, this mutant beast, is just terrifying. But then the Ancient of Days comes. And this is God. The Ancient of Days comes. And there's this courtroom scene. And he judges all things. But what is unique is that there are thrones. And the Ancient of Days only sits on one of them. And the question that should spark in our minds is, what's going to happen with this empty throne? What's going on with this empty throne? And maybe you think back to Genesis 1-3, how humanity was called to rule with God. Humanity was supposed to rule with God, which is mind-blowing in and of itself, but humanity forfeited that. Rather than worshiping God and ruling alongside of God, humanity rebelled, and we became like beasts, violent, corruptive beasts. And so the question throughout all of the Old Testament is, who will now come and occupy that throne that God set up for humans to rule with him? Abraham? I mean, he was pretty great, this great man of faith. No. What about Moses? Moses was incredible. What about David? What about another one of the prophets? Like, who will be this? And what we find over and over and over throughout the Old Testament is no one is worthy. No one can occupy the throne. No one can follow God perfectly. No one can rule with God. And then Daniel sees someone, it says, like a son of man coming on the clouds up to the Ancient of Days, and he's invited to rule with him. And he's given dominion and glory, and all things worship him. And so the Jewish people, at this time, Daniel's prophesying, and this is in Babylon during their 70 years of captivity, hundreds of years before Jesus. From this moment on, this was their hope. This is the thing that they look forward to. This is the thing they told their kids about and their grandkids about. These were the stories that they told at night. They talked about the Son of Man coming on the clouds, God giving him dominion, and then giving his people dominion with him. But they were ruled by Persia. They were ruled by the Greeks. They were ruled by Rome. They were oppressed. They were mistreated in their own land that was supposed to be given to them by God. And so they talked about, they thought about, they daydreamed about, they prayed for, they hoped for this to come true, that the Son of Man would come in his glory, in his kingdom. And now Jesus has just said to some of them, some of you are not going to die before you see this happening. It's going to happen in your lifetime. This was so exciting for these. I can't imagine what this reaction was like. What? Are you kidding me? I mean, think about the things that you look forward to. I mean, look forward to your birthday, or for some of you, birth month. Some of you look forward to Christmas. You look forward to a first date, a first kiss, a wedding. You look forward to a promotion. We look forward to a number of things in life. But think about things that you like daydream about. Something that you're so excited about that you kind of get lost. You're having a conversation with someone, all of a sudden you're thinking about this thing because you're so excited about it. You find yourself at work not doing work at all because you're excited about this thing, this vacation, or whatever it is that's going to happen. This is what it would have been like for the disciples, times about 10. They're standing there, and Jesus says, some of you are going to get to see this thing all of Israel for hundreds of years had been looking forward to. Imagine them trying to go to sleep that night. Not happening, right? They're not going, they're so excited. What if it happens tomorrow? I can imagine them for the next week just tugging on Jesus's cloak, being like, hey, is today the day? Is it going to happen today? Jesus, am I one of the ones? Am I going to get to see it? Jesus, come on. And then Matthew says this, to directly tie what Jesus said to this next story, chapter 17, verse 1, it says, and after 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John, his brother, and he led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them. And his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as light. And behold, there appeared to him Moses and Elijah talking with him. And Peter said to Jesus, Lord, it's good that we are here. If you wish, I'll make 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. And he was still speaking when, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them. And a voice from the cloud said, this is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. When the disciples heard this, they fell on their faces and were terrified. But Jesus came, and he touched them, saying, rise and have no fear. And when they lifted up their eyes, they saw no one but Jesus only. And as they were coming down the mountain, Jesus commanded them Tell no one the vision until the Son of Man is raised from the dead. And the disciples ask him, well, then why do the scribes say that first Elijah must come? And he answered, Elijah does come, and he will restore all things. But I tell you that Elijah has already come. And they did not recognize him, but did to him whatever they pleased. So also the Son of Man will certainly suffer at their hands. Then the disciples understood that he was speaking to them of John the Baptist. Now, what's going on here? 6 days later from this epic moment, he says, Peter, James, John, why don't you come with me? And at first, I think this can feel kind of exclusive. Like, that's not fair. Why those three? Why not Matthew? You know? Why not Judas? Why not Simon the Zealot? Like, why those three? It seems kind of exclusive. And in our understanding the way the world works, that makes total sense. But in God's economy, it's very different than that. Jesus doesn't choose three to be exclusive. He chooses three so that he can be more inclusive. See, Jesus cares deeply about the way of transformation is discipleship. And there's some level of discipleship that can happen in masses, in crowds. Jesus would teach to crowds. And there's some level of discipleship that can happen when you live life in community. You know, Jesus had, 12 disciples and some other people that he traveled with, some women and some other important people that he traveled with and just kind of lived life with. But Jesus knew that there's a level of discipleship that only happens in smaller groups of people. And if we want to be a church of disciple-making disciple makers, then we need to care deeply about this size group as well. If you don't have this size group in your life, you need to. It's an essential piece of our discipleship towards Jesus because there are things that only happen in smaller groups of people. Vulnerability that only happens in smaller groups of people. People that really know you and can encourage you and challenge you and inspire you and walk with you into deeper intimacy with Jesus. Major transformation happens in those smaller groups, and Jesus wanted to model this. And so he took with him Peter, James, and John, not because he loved them more, not because they were extra special, but because that's the way of discipleship. And he brings them up just like he did in the room where he raised the little girl to life, or even in the Garden of Gethsemane later on when he goes and he's praying and he tells the disciples to stay there, but then he invites Peter, James, and John to come further with him into his vulnerability, into this place of just great anguish and pain, because that's the way of discipleship. And then he takes them up onto this mountain and he's just transfigured before their eyes. Like, I can't even imagine. I mean, it's just like normal. We're just hanging out. 4 guys are walking up a mountain. Jesus is normal. He's human, skin, flesh, right? Just normal. And then all of a sudden, bam, his face shone like the sun. Have you ever done the sun stare? Yeah, you don't do that twice, right? Because it hurts your eyes. Could you imagine you're just talking to Jesus, all of a sudden his face is like the sun. You're like, whoa! And then his clothes are so bright white. In Mark, I think his version says, whiter than any like laundry detergent or bleach could make them. Like, it's just so white. And you're thinking, that's incredible, that's amazing, just because of the experience. But it also would bring back so many echoes of God in the Old Testament. Because throughout the Old Testament, God is described in these ways. Shining like the sun, like bronze, like being in a furnace, that bright, fire coming from him. All of these bright lightning imagery about God, that he wraps himself in light. And so not only are they seeing Jesus transfigured before their eyes, but now they're thinking, oh my, when I said he was the Son of God, like I meant it, but I don't know that I really meant it. Not like this. Blowing all of their categories that they had in their mind for who Jesus is. And then Moses and Elijah show up. Why Moses and Elijah? Well, these two people in Jewish theology were deeply connected to the eschaton, or the end times. And both these guys lived pretty impressive lives. Right? They both perform many miracles. You think about Moses with the 10 plagues in Egypt, splitting the Red Sea in two, obviously through God's power, but doing it, Moses doing it, Elijah in the same thing. Elijah, he caused, obviously God did it, but through Elijah caused a drought to happen for 3 years, and then he prayed and water came. You have this incredible moment where Elijah is up on the mountain and he's challenging the prophets of Baal because all of Israel has come to follow this false god Baal. And so Elijah says, enough is enough. And he says, here's what I want you to do. All of you prophets of Baal, you come up here and you put an altar together and you put some sort of offering on the altar. And I'm going to do the same. And whoever God consumes their offering, that's the real God. That's the one true God. And so all of the prophets of Baal, they're praying and they're praising and they're calling him to come down, calling down fire over and over. And it just keeps happening. Nothing happens. And Elijah starts to mock him. He starts to make fun of him like, hey, is he busy? What's going on? And he says, all right, enough is enough. Here's what I want you to do. Now I want you to pour all kinds of water onto my offering. Because he really wants to prove the point. Because typically things that are saturated in water don't burn very well. And Elijah says, I want to prove to you whose God is God. And so they douse it and drench it in water. And then he calls on God. And God just consumes the whole thing. So you have these two incredible men that do these amazing miracles and are leading the people. They're also guys who speak for God. Like they're both prophets. God uses them to speak to the people. These are two impressive guys. Both of them encounter God up on Mount Sinai. Moses with the burning bush, and then again when he's receiving the commandments. And then Elijah, right after this incident with the prophets of Baal, he runs down to Mount Sinai and he encounters God. It's that moment where it's not in the earthquake and it's not in the whirlwind, but in the whisper that he encounters God. And Moses, where God says, hey, you can't see my face, but I'm gonna hide you. I'm gonna cover you with my hand and I'm gonna pass by and you're gonna see like the radiance of my glory. But they both encounter God powerfully on a high mountain. Elijah never died. He was taken up with a chariot of fire. Both of them were believed by the Jewish people that they would return at the eschaton. So now you're the disciples. You've heard Jesus talk about the Son of Man prophecy. You're going to get to see it. You're here. You're knowing this is it. This is happening. Moses and Elijah have showed up. Jesus is transfigured before our eyes. This is the Son of Man stuff happening. Like, Peter, you seeing this? Yeah. John, you? Yes. What in the world? What's going on? Peter can't handle it, so he just starts talking. He just starts talking, I don't know what to do, I'll build some tents. Some of us are doers and we got to do stuff, and I get that. God created us that way, and that's amazing. Some of us are talkers and we just got to say stuff. But there are certain moments where talking only ruins the moment. I know for some of you verbal processes, your mind is blown right now. Nuh-uh, words are always good. Sometimes they're not. And this is one of those moments because God the Father interrupts Peter while he is still talking. In the book of Luke, it says Peter didn't know what he was saying. In John, it said he was so afraid he just started uttering words. He just didn't know what to do. And I don't blame him one bit. I don't know that I would know what to do. All of a sudden, Jesus is just transfigured into the Son of Man thing that I've been hoping for, thinking about, praying for. All of Israel's been waiting for. It's happening right now in front of my eyes. It's going on. And then God the Father in a cloud. And you know this because in the Old Testament, he's often in a cloud on top of Mount Sinai and the pillar of cloud. And it's bright and lightning. And they are terrified. Because when you realize that you are in the presence of the God of the universe, the only appropriate response is to fall to your knees in worship. Later on, John has the same reaction when he encounters the resurrected Lord Jesus in his revelation. They're terrified. There are a number of people that have these incredibly deep, rich voices. I'm not one of them. But I think about James Earl Jones. I think about Morgan Freeman. People that have, at some point in time, spoken either the scriptures or as that plain God as a character, and you're like, oh yeah, that's what God sounds like. Yes, for sure. I want you to do my answering machine, please. But that's not what God sounds like. See, at their voice, I'm like, yes, that is beautiful, rich, and powerful. At God's voice, you fall down on your knees in terror because he is so holy, so beyond, so above, so righteous, so pure. And you know that you don't belong in your sinful flesh in his presence. Rarely do we do justice to the holiness of God. I find in my own life at times I'll even be praising God and I'm not doing justice to his holiness. I'm not enwrapped by who he actually is and the reality of my fallen, sinful flesh in his presence. It's good to be reminded of God's holiness, and in this moment, the Father reminds them, you're in one of those moments. In Ecclesiastes, it says, when you enter into the house of God, don't be quick to utter some speech. He says that's the sacrifice of fools. This is a moment for awe, to just sit and be enwrapped by the presence of Jesus being transformed before their eyes. And then this incredible thing happens. And Matthew says it so beautifully. What we see is it says they lifted up their eyes and they saw no one but Jesus only. And actually in the Greek, it's even better than this. What it is when it says there was no one else, that in the Greek is really kind of repeated twice. And then when it says Jesus only, that's repeated twice. And the reason we don't see it in English is because it doesn't make sense in English. But basically, what it would be saying is they didn't see anyone at all except Jesus himself only, which sounds kind of redundant. But Matthew is saying it this way because he wants us to be clear about something. That although Jesus is here with Moses and Elijah don't hold a candle to Jesus. Not even Moses, not even Elijah, not even these two great men empowered by God to speak for God, who saw an aspect of God. They don't hold a candle to Jesus. Not even Moses, who wrote the first 5 books of the Old Testament. One of the greatest prophets, one of the greatest rulers in Israel's history. When everything was said and done, there was only Jesus there with them. They looked up, and it was only Jesus. And then Jesus says this. He says, don't tell anyone. Who here's a bad secret keeper? Come on, be honest. We have some bad secret keepers. It's okay. The reason mainly is because God created us to be social creatures. And having an experience that no one else knows about, it eats at us. But it's part of who we're created to be. We need to share. When something awesome happens, when you do something awesome, when you see something incredible, first thing you do, you call someone. You go tell someone. I can't believe, you're never going to believe it. You're going to believe who I saw. One time I was in the mall in Orlando, and I wasn't in junior high. I was in the mall, and I was walking, and you know who was behind me? Shaq. Yeah, Shaquille O'Neal. I was like, Shaq's following me. Every time I turned around, he'd act like he wasn't following me because he was embarrassed that he was following me, It's kind of awkward. Jesus said, don't tell anyone. I don't know what I would have done had I seen Shaq and not been able to share it with anyone. Shaq, you're huge. What in the world? Imagine this experience. And Jesus saying, oh yeah, don't tell anybody. Especially you, Peter. You know what I'm saying? Come on. How in the world could they hold that in? Well, the reason he says it, and you see it in that he gives it a time limit, don't tell anyone until what happens? Until he's raised from the grave. Because there are 2 elements that are necessary for people to really understand this moment in its context. And that is Jesus' death and resurrection. Because without that, people will misunderstand what the disciples are saying. As we've already seen, there was so much misunderstanding with the Messiah and what they thought, what they hoped he would do, what they wanted him to do, desired for him to do. And so Jesus says, don't tell anyone until I'm raised from the grave. Because these are two important aspects of what need to be there for people to really understand what's happening. Because although, yes, I said you wouldn't taste death until you see the Son of Man come in his glory, and then 6 days later, you're seeing me in my glory. It's only a piece of this prophecy being fulfilled. Another big piece of it will be Jesus being raised up on the cross next to two thieves. There's more to come in this vision for them to understand and grasp fully. And so he says, hold on, don't tell anyone. And I can't imagine how they did that. And then Jesus reminds them, even though you've just seen me like this, I certainly will suffer and die. Once again, he doesn't want them to get caught up in the moment, in the glory, in the excitement, and think, hey, it's going to be easy. We're just going to come down the mountain and we're going to just take over. I mean, you saw Jesus, he's God. The Father spoke and we couldn't even stand. It was like, when the people of Israel came up to the mountain to hear God, and God spoke and they're like, stop. Moses, you go up there and you listen. We'll listen to you, but we don't want to hear God speak. We might die just from the sound of his voice. I'm sure they're thinking, yes, we're going to come down and conquer, but that's not the way. That was not the way of the Messiah. It's not to bypass human suffering. It's to enter into it. And so Jesus reminds them, I certainly will suffer at their hands, just like John did. I will die, but I'll be raised again. That's when you can share this story. Now, this is an epic moment in the history of humanity. And I think the central thing that I want us to focus in on is this phrase. They saw no one else at all but Jesus himself only. Just take a second and think about that. They saw no one else at all except Jesus himself only. As you're pondering that, I'm going to invite Jay and Nancy to come back up and help us respond. But this is the key, men and women. This is what Matthew wants us to see so clearly. This is what he wants us to be captivated by. Because Jesus himself alone is the Word made flesh. Because Jesus himself alone is the image of the invisible God. He, Jesus alone, is the radiance of God's glory and the exact imprint of his nature. All the fullness of God is pleased to dwell in Jesus alone, not Moses, not Elijah. Jesus alone. At his name, every knee will bow on heaven and earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus alone is Lord to the glory of God the Father. Jesus himself alone was transfigured, not Moses and Elijah. And he shone with his own divine glory, not a derivative glory, but his own glory. But I tell you what, that's not what's been gripping my heart recently. What's been gripping my heart about this is that it wasn't, this supernatural glowing Jesus that touched them when they were terrified. And it wasn't this beyond human Jesus walking down with them. Jesus chose once again to walk the divine but humble road of submission, suffering, and death. He chose once again to clothe himself in ordinary, mundane human flesh and not walk away from our pain into some cosmic divine throne room, but instead down into our mess and carry it on his shoulders as if it was his to bear. That Jesus would do that for me. And he'd do that for you because we were outside of God's family with no hope, stuck in our sin, with certain doom ahead of us. And Jesus said, I'm not going to stay here up on this mountain. I'm not going to stay transfigured. I'm not going to ascend into heaven at this moment. But just like when he said no to the enemy and the temptation, he said yes again to us. And he said, I'm going to walk down this difficult road, down the Via Dolorosa, the path to the cross. That Jesus' path to glory was so different, but it was necessary for us. This is why we fix our eyes on Jesus, because he is the author of our faith and he's the perfecter of our faith, and that it was only through his death and resurrection that we are able to now enter into God's presence and get this, not in fear and terror, but with confidence. It says now we can approach God's throne of grace with confidence. With confidence. Me, you. Because Jesus said yes to the difficult road of suffering and death so that we could be in his family and be with him for all of eternity. You know, when we refix our eyes on Jesus, everything changes. Our perspective shifts and everything changes. And so my hope and my prayer for us this morning is that God's Spirit would help us to refix our eyes on Jesus. So let's ask him to.